Rick Sanchez has countless secrets which he is hiding, ranging from small to very big and complicated ones. Therefore, so you can understand exactly what he's hiding, I'm gonna go over every important secret Rick has and reveal the depths of who he really is, because he's definitely not who you may think. So get ready, sit back, grab a snack if you want, and enjoy. The Rick which we get to see throughout the show is from Dimension C-137, so he is often known as Rick C-137. But it turns out that even Rick's name is a lie, and that it isn't really Rick. This is something which we as the audience come to know in Season 5, Episode 1, titled Mort Dinner Rick Andre, when a very longtime friend of Rick named Mr. Nimbus is visiting, and refers to Rick as Richard.
Nimbus? Richard? Perhaps Richard has no one with whom he can trust his life.
So maybe instead of the show being called Rick and Morty, it should be Richard and Morty. I know Rick is a shortened form of Richard, so this may not seem too crazy, but this is only the start, and I'm only going to get into much deeper secrets, such as how in this same episode, we find out that Rick may have had another sidekick before Morty, named Kyle, because when Morty is serving wine to Rick and Mr. Nimbus, Nimbus says this:
I liked your other one more. What was his name? Kyle?
What? Nothing. Can we just sign this thing and go?
You may be thinking that maybe Nimbus just means that Rick had a personal wine boy named Kyle, or something along those lines. But I believe it goes a lot deeper than that. As in Season 5, Episode 9, titled Forgetting Sarek Mortschel, Rick gets angry at Morty for putting Mountain Dew in his portal gun, and mentions how he has sidekick rules, where if Morty doesn't follow them, he can be replaced. Morty seems to think that Rick isn't serious about replacing him, and calls him out. This causes Rick's big ego to make him decide to actually replace Morty, so he pulls out a wheel which he made that'll help him decide what sidekick he should replace Morty with. One of the options on the wheel is Kyle 2.0. The fact that it's 2.0 would mean that Rick has in fact had another sidekick whose name was Kyle, and that Kyle probably wasn't just a wine boy. So who actually is Kyle? Well, in Season 2, Episode 6, titled The Ricks Must Be Crazy, we're shown a potential answer. When needing to repair his car battery, Rick travels inside of it with Morty, and it turns out that he made an entire civilization which lives inside the battery and works to power it. The reason Rick's battery wasn't working in the first place is because a scientist named Zeep who lives inside the battery developed his own battery, which replaces the need for people to do work to produce power for Rick's car. And inside of Zeep's battery lives yet another civilization of people with a scientist working on his own battery as well. When talking with this scientist, Zeep refers to him as Kyle.
This is wrong, Kyle. This is slavery.
Interesting. I mean, Kyle is an intelligent scientist, so he would be a good potential sidekick for Rick. But I personally don't necessarily think that this is the true answer, mainly because of Rick seemingly being surprised that Zeep was even working on a battery in the first place. And on top of that, Kyle the scientist refers to Rick as that guy, rather than seeming to have a more personal relationship with him.
So he made a universe, and that guy is from that universe, and that guy made a universe.
So what really is the answer to the question of who Kyle actually is? Well, I'll talk about that more soon enough, so keep watching the video. But first we'll need to dive even deeper into the depths of Rick's secret backstory. Maybe then we can find hidden answers. Season 3, Episode 1, titled The Rick Shank Redemption, is the first major time in the series we get some deep insights regarding some of the depths of Rick's secret backstory, which supposedly happened before the series itself even takes place. In this episode, Rick is being interrogated by the Galactic Federation, and they are doing so by speaking to him within his own subconscious mind. During this interrogation, we get to see a memory which Rick has before he made a breakthrough in portal travel technology. In this memory, while working in his garage trying to figure out portal travel, an alternate version of himself comes and speaks with him. This alternate version of Rick is known as Rick Prime. Rick Prime lets our Rick know that once he has access to portal travel technology, anything becomes possible, and that our Rick will essentially become a god with it. Upon hearing Rick Prime's explanation of what happens once getting portal travel technology, our Rick decides to pass on being handed the technology by Rick Prime, because he views himself as a different kind of Rick. And this causes Rick Prime to leave Rick's garage, while letting him know that no versions of Rick pass on getting portal technology.
Bro, Ricks don't pass on this. Who do you think you are? A different kind of Rick, I guess. Well, we'll see how long that lasts.
After Rick Prime leaves, Rick decides that he should give up on science and live a more humble life rather than becoming a god with no consequences. Then shortly after this, while going to get ice cream with his daughter Beth and his wife Diane, a portal opens up in the garage and a bomb falls through it, which kills both Beth and Diane. And this then causes Rick to immediately begin figuring out the math required to invent portal travel while in his blown up garage. Although, keep in mind, all of this takes place in Rick's subconscious mind while he is being interrogated, and after the audience gets to see these events of Rick's past, Rick lets the interrogator know that he fabricated this backstory. So, is any of it actually real? Or is this just one of the many layers of the secret life which Rick is living? Well, if we go forward in the series to Season 5, Episode 10, titled Rick Mirai Jack, we can answer that question. In this episode, Morty gets to see a scan of Rick's brain and is made aware of the truths to his backstory. It turns out that even though Rick claimed the backstory was fabricated while being interrogated, most of it actually wasn't. Morty gets to see the events where Rick Prime talks to our Rick and then proceeds to kill his family. But rather than immediately inventing portal travel, Rick dealt with depression for a while living alone. Then later on he decided to follow through with inventing portal travel and essentially becoming a god, just like Rick Prime predicted.
Well, we'll see how long that lasts.
And he did so, all so he could get revenge on Rick Prime. Using the portal technology which he was forced to invent because of his want for revenge, our Rick travels to multiple realities and begins killing countless Ricks, hoping that one of them is Rick Prime. He even bombs a giant gathering of Ricks who are angry over him killing alternate versions of them across multiple realities. And doing so makes tons of other Ricks submit to him out of fear. Because of so many Ricks realizing the godlike power of Rick C-137, they decide to construct a citadel with him, where Ricks and Mortys are able to reside, hang out, and get along with one another. Although Rick C-137 doesn't really seem to care for the citadel and only cares about his mission for revenge, which leads him to eventually find Rick Prime's original dimension, so he then purposefully crashes into Prime's garage. And it turns out Rick Prime abandoned his family. I mean, we do know that Rick Prime doesn't have any attachment to anything.
Imagine going anywhere, anytime with nobody able to stop you. Sounds lonely. Lonely? Dude, you have yourself. Your infinite selves. It's a non-stop party where all the guests are the only person we like.
So it does make sense why he'd do this. Because Rick C-137 can assume that Rick Prime will never come back to his original family, he decides to take his place, living with an adult version of Beth and her family. From Beth and the family's perspective, they just think that Rick Prime finally came back after a long time, but in reality, it's just an alternate version of him from another dimension who wanted to fill the hole of loneliness in his life that was caused by the murder of his wife and daughter. On top of this, Rick C-137 essentially adopts Rick Prime's grandson Morty as his own, without him ever knowing. And this gives Rick a whole new kind of relationship in his life, as he himself never had a grandson before, because his original daughter never grew old enough to have kids. After all this trauma, it seems Rick has found his place and is happy with his new grandson and family. And then from that point, the series itself begins. Although this relationship with Morty might not be as strong as you may think. The fact that Rick decided to keep his story a secret as long as possible is interesting, and may really say something about an even bigger secret which he's hiding. One regarding the type of person he is, and his uncaring approach to personal relationships in his life, and reality as a whole. A good first example of this during the series is in Season 1, Episode 6, titled Rick Potion number 9. In this episode, because of a love potion which Rick made Morty going horribly wrong, a worldwide apocalypse is caused. So Rick decides to take Morty with him to live in a new dimension known as Dimension C-131. This dimension is very similar to Rick Prime's dimension, which is the one they were living in and just destroyed by accident. But rather than the apocalypse destroying this new dimension, alternate versions of themselves in C-131 are able to fix the apocalypse, but die in a lab accident shortly after doing so. So Rick C-137 and Morty Prime then take their place and bury the bodies in their backyard, all while their new family is left unaware of this, because of Rick actively choosing to keep these events a secret from the family, and deciding to continue on with life as normal, while only Morty is aware of the truth. Because this is Morty's first time experiencing something as crazy as moving to a new reality, he seems traumatized by the entire situation. But Rick is completely unfazed, as he's already done this before. I mean, even the Morty he's been living with isn't his grandson, so why would he be traumatized at this point? But what if I told you this isn't just Rick's second time switching families, and that I believe there may be a much deeper reason why he's so unfazed by this incident, as this could actually be his 9th time switching families, or potentially he's done it even more than that. I mean, think about it. Why is the very title of this episode called Rick Potion number 9. Some of you are probably thinking, well, that's just a pop culture reference to the song Love Potion number 9, and many of Rick and Morty's episode titles are pop culture references. Now that may be true, but this secret goes deeper. I believe it's not just a pop culture reference, and that this is the 9th potion Rick has made which went horribly wrong and caused him to move to a new reality. I know that sounds like a big claim, but I have evidence to back it up, so stay with me. We'll get into that in just a minute, but before we do, if you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to like it as well as subscribe to the channel for more content like it. Now back to the video. The start of this evidence comes from a hidden detail in Season 1, Episode 10, titled Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. In this episode, the Citadel of Ricks, which I mentioned earlier, apparently has no trust for Rick C-137, because of the killings of other Ricks which he committed in the past. So they arrest him and bring him to the Citadel, where they blame him for some recent killings of Ricks which have been going on. And they then scan his portal gun, and it appears that he's been traveling to the places where these Ricks have been being killed. Rick C-137 claims that it's a setup and that he's innocent, but the Citadel still wants to punish him. So he and Morty make an escape and then go on a mission to track down the real killer. This causes them to end up finding the lair of the killer, which has a bunch of Mortys strapped to the outside of it, being purposefully put through agonizing pain.
I fiddled with a concept like this once. On paper, Morty, on paper. I mean, you could accomplish the same result with like 5 Mortys and a jumper cable. Which I also wouldn't do.
I think this may just be Rick expressing how little attachment he really does have for everything, including Morty. When in the lair, they come across the Rick who's actually behind the murders. He's called Evil Rick. As well, he has a sidekick called Evil Morty. Later on, we find out Evil Morty is actually puppeting Evil Rick to do all of this, but that's a topic for another video I have, which I'll link at the end of this one. Evil Rick then captures both Rick and Morty, and he tells Rick how similar they actually are. Apparently, there's only one other Rick between them and how different they are. So maybe our Rick actually would do the whole thing with, Morty strapped to an evil lair? Who knows? Shortly after showing them how similar they are, Evil Rick reveals to Rick C-137 that he plans on downloading the contents of his brain and then killing him. While Rick C-137's brain is being downloaded by Evil Rick, some of his past memories are displayed on a computer monitor, and we get to see him with a baby Morty, which is a memory that causes Rick to tear up, which I think would mean he potentially has some level of attachment to this baby Morty. But how is this even possible to begin with? Because remember, like I talked about earlier, when we get to see part of Rick's backstory in Season 5 Episode 10 titled Rick Mirai Jack, during the part where Rick C-137 supposedly moves to Rick Prime's reality and secretly adopts his family, Beth is an adult, and Morty is already a teenager at that point. So where does this memory of baby Morty come from? Rick's original wife and daughter died, so this baby being his grandson from his original reality is out of the picture, as the Beth from that reality never grew old enough to have kids. This could mean that the entirety of his backstory wasn't actually revealed in Season 5 Episode 10, and that he may have lived in other realities before coming to Rick Prime's reality, and in one of them he got to live with a baby Morty. Wow. That might mean that my theory from earlier about Rick Potion number 9 being Rick's 9th time switching families/realities, or potentially that he's done it even more than 9 times, suddenly isn't seeming so crazy anymore. It would seem he's probably lived with countless Mortys before he began living with Morty Prime, and the evidence doesn't even stop there. In Season 2, Episode 5, titled Get Swifty, Morty steals Rick's portal gun and travels to different dimensions alone. While doing this, he ends up with one of Rick's longtime friends named Birdperson. During this time with Birdperson, it would be hard to know if Morty is in dimension C-131 or another one completely, just because of the fact that he's been portal traveling while not knowing what he's doing. But the whole reason he's portal traveling in the first place is because of an ongoing game show hosted by Giant Heads, which determines the fate of Earth, and is going on in dimension C-131. The TV at Birdperson's house happens to show planet Earth on this same game show, so I think it's probably safe to assume that while with Birdperson, Morty is in dimension C-131. During Morty's time at Birdperson's house, he sees a picture of a young version of Rick holding a baby on the wall, and Morty asks this:
Who's that baby?
You may think that this baby is just Morty C-131, which is the Morty who died in a lab accident, and that Morty Prime took the place of. That may be true, but Morty Prime is aware of Morty C-131 dying, and I'd think he could easily recognize a baby version of his alternate self, which makes me think that his questioning of who's that baby may have deeper meaning, and could mean that this baby isn't Morty C-131, or maybe even a Morty at all, and that's why Morty is curious who the baby is. Could this baby be the Kyle I mentioned earlier? I know you're probably thinking, While that baby being Kyle doesn't make much sense because the Rick in that picture is probably Rick C-131 and not Rick C-137 anyway, so it doesn't matter who the baby is. While back in the episode Rick Potion number 9, when Rick and Morty even moved into dimension C-131 in the first place, Rick mentioned how there are infinite realities and that in a few of them he got lucky, solved the apocalypse issue, and turned everything back to normal. He just had to find one where they also happened to die at this particular point in the timeline. So essentially by replacing their dead counterparts, they aren't even skipping a beat because of the similarities between Prime's dimension and dimension C-131.
We're not skipping a beat, Morty.
This alone means that dimension C-131 is practically the same as Rick Prime's reality, which Morty Prime and Rick C-137 were living in, at least up to the moment in time where the apocalypse was fixed and Rick C-131 and Morty C-131 died. This could potentially mean that similar to how Rick C-131 had this baby in his life, so did Rick C-137. So it is quite possible that the baby we see from season 1 episode 10 during the time where Rick C-137 is getting his brain scanned by evil Rick may in fact be Kyle. So is the whole "who's Kyle" question answered then? Well, it could be, but I think there's an even deeper secret to be explored, which would tell us that it's not, and that the real answer may just be that Rick sadly doesn't have much care for Morty, and that Morty Prime actually had his memory erased by Rick, so therefore he forgot his own childhood completely, which caused him to not be able to recognize or relate to who this baby is, even though it may just be an alternate version of himself with many similarities. I know this sounds crazy and complicated, so I'm gonna have to break down some even deeper truths and secrets which Rick is hiding, so we can understand this further. You might want to grab yet another snack, because we've just started and things are only gonna get crazier. If we go back to season 1, episode 10 titled Close Encounters of the Rick Kind, while Rick is getting his brain scanned by evil Rick, we see yet another interesting memory of his, which shows a Morty being electrocuted. This is probably a direct reference to the whole jumper cable thing earlier in the episode.
I mean, you could accomplish the same result with like 5 Mortys and a jumper cable. Which I also wouldn't do.
Yeah, I think Rick was probably lying about not doing that kind of thing, considering he has this memory. But why is this important though? Well, to understand the whole Morty got his childhood memories wiped theory, we first need to truly understand how little Rick values Morty, and the extent of which he treats him as disposable. And I believe that this is a good starting point. Rick viewing Morty as disposable is clearly demonstrated towards the end of this episode as well, when after Rick has proven his innocence and exposed the real killer of countless Ricks, the council then apologizes for falsely accusing Rick, and as a gift for their mistake, they offer him a voucher for a free replacement Morty. And Rick acts like he doesn't want it while in front of Morty, but snags it on his way out. I wonder why he'd possibly need that. I'll continue with why he may need it, and more ways he treats Morty as disposable soon enough. But first we need to go over some other important secrets of Rick's, so we can have a better idea of the bigger picture. Currently, it would seem that Rick C-137 moved into Rick Prime's family's house when Morty Prime was a teenager, and then from there season 1 of the show started. But I think it's potentially even more complicated than that, and that this backstory which Morty sees is incomplete, and doesn't contain the full truth. During the time in season 5 episode 10 when Morty is first exposed to Rick's backstory, and Rick C-137 supposedly crashes into Rick Prime's house, there's one very important detail which may have been missed. The driveway of the house which he crashes into is cracked. Why does this matter though? Well, let me explain. Throughout season 1, the driveway is cracked like this, and in season 1, episode 6, titled Rick Potion number 9, we know that Rick and Morty leave the Prime Dimension to move to dimension C-131, which is a dimension that has operated practically the same as the Prime Dimension up until the whole apocalypse incident. And in episodes 7 through 10 in season 1, this cracked driveway is still present, even though at this point they're now in C-131 during this time. And it's cracked due to the similarities of C-131 and the Prime Dimension. But here's the thing, in season 1, episode 11 titled Ricksy Business, while in dimension C-131, Morty accidentally teleports the house to another dimension, which cracks the driveway further, and eventually the house is brought back to dimension C-131, but the driveway remains cracked from this incident. And from then on out in the series, the driveway stays cracked like this, instead of like this. This new crack which happens while in dimension C-131 matches the crack of when Rick C-137 supposedly comes to Rick Prime's dimension to live with his family during his backstory flashback. So does this crack mean that Rick C-137 actually didn't come across Morty Prime in Rick Prime's reality, but rather in C-131? Potentially, but not necessarily. Later during the series in season 7 episode 5 titled Unmort Rickin', when Rick C-137 finally encounters Rick Prime, Prime mocks him for living with his family in his house.
I showed you infinity! And what did you do with it? Hang out with my grandson? Raise echoes of my daughter? You lived in my house!
So this would mean that Rick C-137 did live in the Prime Dimension at least for some time, and didn't necessarily just live with Morty Prime in Dimension C-131. Potentially Rick C-137 came to the Prime Dimension and replaced Rick Prime much earlier than we think, and before Morty was a teenager. Maybe this is why he has the memory of what appears to be a baby Morty. My guess is after living with Morty Prime in C-131 for a while, Rick C-137 probably decided to leave C-131 for whatever reason, and then later came back to it, which could be the real reason behind this scene during his backstory where he crashes into the house with this cracked driveway, which matches the crack of C-131's driveway after Season 1, Episode 11. So this may just be Dimension C-131 in the flashback, and not Rick Prime's dimension. This could be why in Season 2, Episode 10, titled The Wedding Squanchers, while living in C-131, Beth mentions to Jerry how she doesn't want Rick to leave again.
We're gonna do whatever Rick wants, whenever he wants.
Yes! Why?
Because I don't want him to leave again, you dumb asshole!
And she probably says again because Rick may have temporarily abandoned the family of C-131, as well as Morty Prime, and left them in Dimension C-131 for a while, only to later come back when he felt like it. I mean, it would seem Rick C-137 does consistently do things like lie to and mistreat his own family, so this definitely is possible. Another good example of Rick lying to his family is in Season 3, Episode 9, titled The ABCs of Beth. While talking to Beth C-131, Rick C-137 mentions how he made her plenty of interesting toys during her childhood.
Look at some of the you were asking me to make you as a kid.
But obviously he's lying, because Rick C-131 would have been living with Beth C-131 during her childhood, and not Rick C-137. Although maybe Rick C-137 is referring to his time in the Prime Dimension when he says this, where maybe he made an alternate version of her these toys, because he probably views Beth Prime and Beth C-131 as essentially the same person, because of how closely related their two realities are. This could mean that Rick C-137 may have moved to Prime's dimension when Beth Prime was still a kid, and potentially when his wife Diane was still alive as well, and he did so in order to fill the void inside of himself, caused by the death of his family in Dimension C-137. This could be how he got to see Morty as a baby, and have memories of him. Crazy. So Rick C-137's lie to Beth C-131 may not seem like that bad of a lie, to be completely honest, because technically he did make Beth those toys, just an alternate version of her. So maybe I'm somewhat wrong about how Rick treats his family poorly then? I mean, his very being does seem to be based off of his consciousness and not his physical body, and this is evident in Season 3 Episode 1 where he transfers his consciousness between different Ricks to overthrow the government, as well as in Season 4 Episode 1 where he dies countless times and his consciousness transfers between alternate clones of himself. And in Season 7, Episode 9, where the same thing happens when he dies fighting Bigfoot and the Pope. So he very well could have had good intentions, and not have been outright trying to lie when talking to Beth C-131 about how he made her these toys, because he may view himself as every Rick in existence. Although there definitely still are some big ways he shows lack of care for his family. And realistically, he probably doesn't tell Beth C-131 this lie with good intentions. I mean, he literally has abandoned a version of his family in an apocalyptic world in Season 1 Episode 6, and left Beth Prime like this. So yeah, I'd say Rick probably truly doesn't care much about his family, and was just trying to cover his butt when speaking to Beth C-131 about the toys he supposedly made her, so she wouldn't catch on to deep secrets of his. You know, ones like how he views people as interchangeable and disposable, all while trying to hide this fact from them. And coming back to how he does this with Morty, it turns out that Rick has in fact been deleting memories of his, like I mentioned earlier. This is shown in Season 3, Episode 8, titled Morty's Mind Blowers, where it's revealed that Rick has constantly been deleting traumatizing memories from Morty's mind. Now you're probably thinking, what's wrong with that? He's saving Morty from remembering traumatizing times by doing so. And yes, that's true, but it turns out that he also does this when it benefits just himself, and not Morty. Such as one time when he accidentally pronounces granted wrong and Morty makes fun of him.
We should never take things for granted. What? It's granted! With a D! What are you, a boulder, a rock person?
So he deletes that memory from Morty's brain. And this could be the link as to why Morty doesn't recognize the baby in this picture as what is probably just a very similar alternate version of himself. Since we can confirm Rick deletes memories of Morty, and he does it for his own benefit, it's quite likely he deleted memories of Morty's entire childhood as well. But why would Rick specifically delete his childhood memories? Well, I believe it may be because Rick has the most fun with Morty while he's a 14-year-old boy, because Morty is old enough to understand many things and do many fun things with Rick, while also not being mature enough to realize the extent which Rick manipulates him. It's the perfect age, and Rick likes mistreating Morty for his own benefit constantly. I mean, Morty's mistreatment is literally a theme throughout the series. Could this be why basically every version of Morty we see in the entire series is a young boy? Could it be because Rick keeps their minds stuck in the present moment as a 14-year-old boy by deleting their past memories and forgetting their childhoods? Well, the answer may just be yes. In Season 5, Episode 10, titled Rick Mirai Jack, Evil Morty shows Morty Prime a brain scan of Rick's C-137. This is the same brain scan from earlier, where it was supposedly evil Rick stealing Rick's C-137's knowledge. In this scan, it shows how Rick mistreats Morty across infinity, and how using his intelligence, he created a branch of infinity called the Central Finite Curve, where he himself is the smartest man alive in every universe. This brain scan also reveals that Mortys are cloned across infinity by different Ricks stealing their DNA and then making clones of them, and essentially factory resetting their memory to whatever they may want it to contain right after the cloning takes place. Also, the Mortys can be put in any reality another version of Rick may need one, and there's an entire assembly line for this. So this is why Rick needed that free Morty replacement ticket from earlier. In this Morty factory, we also see countless dead Mortys. Now, why are there so many dead Mortys in a factory? Well, I believe that all of these Mortys are ones which are taken from their realities as they start to get too old, and are then killed. The mass cloning and killing of Mortys is why all these Mortys across the Central Finite Curve are just the right age for Rick to experience the most personal enjoyment, while not letting any Mortys grow old enough to become mature enough to question it. Most Mortys never even have childhoods, as they're just clones, and are pawns in Rick's self-enjoyment across infinite realities. And on top of this, in Season 7, Episode 10, titled Fear No Mort, we see how Rick is able to de-age himself to potentially stay alive forever, and we already know from earlier that even if he somehow does die, he has backups to transfer his consciousness into as many alternate bodies as he pleases. Rick's entire life is a never-ending cycle of selfishness and inability to control his personal desires. It's the life of a psychopathic man given access to infinite power, and we get to see the fallout of this firsthand. Destruction is caused everywhere he goes, and he will go to major lengths to prevent people from figuring out the truth of who he really is. It's all because he let his own trauma corrupt him. He not only lost his wife and kid, but at the same time lost his empathy towards those around him, including his own family. As long as he can temporarily fill the void inside himself, he doesn't care how he goes about it, all while making sure that those around him know just how powerful he is, and that they mean nothing to him. Because Morty is one of the people who brings him the most personal enjoyment in his life, he has become the biggest victim of this selfishness and trauma, and it's constantly happening across a branch of infinity. And this is Rick's biggest secret of them all. Now, this may sound depressing, but I believe we can take lessons from the secretive life of Rick. Rick may have let his trauma corrupt him to become a selfish man who lacks empathy, but did he have to? No, he had a choice. Just as you and I do. All of us experience trauma and death in our lives. It's part of what makes us human, and we're all much more similar than we think. Whatever you may be going through, there's a high chance someone else is going through something very similar. Both positive and negative times come throughout our lives. It's to be expected. Can you truly experience light if you've never experienced dark? Even if you may be at a low right now, remember you've been happy at some time in your life. Try to find that happiness every day. You can find it as long as you want to. Don't let your own negative emotions cause others trauma. The world will not get any better that way, and you will only find yourself consumed by negativity just as Rick did. Even on the days you may feel down, as long as you can find some amount of positivity to bring to the world, even if it's as simple as giving a stranger a nice compliment, you will find yourself becoming blessed with more and more positivity every day. Whatever you put into the world, you get right back. Even a simple few positive words to someone can make their day, week, year, or even life. It's time we all put in a little work each day to make the world a better and more positive place. Do you want a more positive world or not? The choice is yours. You're more powerful than you think. Now that you know the depths of the secrets which Rick is hiding, here's a video on his entire life story. Also remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. As well, I have a YouTube membership program, which you can join if you'd like to support the channel, and in return get some extra bonus rewards such as custom comment emojis, early access to videos, and so on. Thanks for watching, and remember, you're more powerful than you think.